Hello everyone and welcome back to Creation Myths. This one's going to be a little bit different because we're not doing creationist pseudoscience this time, we're doing COVID-related pseudoscience. The background here is that on Thursday, June 5th, I appeared on Jackson Wheat's channel, there's the video, with John Perry from Stated Clearly to talk about the origins of COVID and specifically the lab leak hypothesis. That conversation is linked down below, and while this video works perfectly well as a standalone, it's also kind of a follow-up to that conversation, so I encourage you to check that out at some point. In that conversation with Jackson and John, my overarching point was that while the lab leak was a perfectly reasonable hypothesis to check out in 2020 when all of this was new, as I sit here recording this in 2025, the lab leak is a conspiracy theory. Full stop. Again, at the beginning of the pandemic, this was a reasonable thing to investigate. It was investigated, and the overwhelming consensus is that there is no hard evidence for a lab leak, and all available evidence points to a natural zoonosis event involving bat coronaviruses and an intermediate host, with the initial jump into humans most likely occurring at a market selling live animals in the city of Wuhan, China. Consequently, the lab leak now requires an extensive cover-up and a multitude of suppressed information. In other words, for the lab leak hypothesis to be correct, there would have to be a massive conspiracy in operation to obscure that fact. In this video, I'm going to briefly go through the evidence we have for a natural zoonotic origin of SARS coronavirus 2, and then get into the evidence against a lab-related origin. And finally, I'll give a rundown of just some of the things that would have to be true for a lab leak to have been covered up this whole time. So let's start with the evidence for a natural origin for SARS coronavirus 2, the virus that causes COVID-19. The strongest evidence for a natural origin for this virus is phylogenetics. The SARS coronavirus 2 clade nests within bat coronaviruses, just like SARS-1, and its sister lineage, its closest relative, is a bat coronavirus, right? So it's like humans and chimps. We are each other's closest relatives. That is SARS coronavirus 2, bat coronaviruses, right? Each other's closest relatives. And in the same way that humans nest within, the ape clade and the primate clade and the mammal clade, SARS coronavirus 2 nests within the larger bat coronavirus clade. We've also identified what is likely to be the exact bat population in which SARS coronavirus 2's ancestors lived, the exact group of bats where SARS coronavirus 2 probably came from, based on the viruses we've collected from various bat populations. Now, in addition to that evidence, we also have the epidemiological data. The market was the epicenter of the earliest stages of the outbreak. You can see that right here. It's crystal clear where the earliest cases clustered. Basically, the market is where it all happened. There is not an earlier known or documented concentration of cases prior to the market cluster. And there were viral samples actually recovered from the market itself. Now, it's been hypothesized that there could have been cryptic circulation before then, which is to say circulation of the virus, well, without anybody realizing what's going on. And that's a thing that could happen in pandemics. That happened with HIV, that happened with the 2009 swine flu. So that's not an unreasonable thing to think might have been the case. And if that was the case, then maybe the market cluster was just a super spreader event, and that's kind of where it exploded, but it existed well before then. But we actually have blood bank samples from blood donors in that area from September through November of 2019 that have been checked, and there have been no SARS coronavirus 2 antibodies found in any of those samples. That's not conclusive evidence, but it's very strong evidence indicating that COVID was not circulating prior to the market outbreak in December of 2019. So you put all of that together, and you have extremely strong evidence for the zoonotic transmission of this novel virus from bats to an intermediate host sold at the market, probably a raccoon dog. That's where the evidence is pointing right now. I'm recording this in June of 2025. That may change, but as of right now, it looks like a raccoon dog is the best candidate for that intermediate host. That then led to an epicenter of initial cases directly associated with the market, and it exploded for there. That's what all the evidence we have says happened. So what about the evidence for a lab leak? Well, there isn't any. In 2018, scientists at the lab and their US collaborators drafted a paper that was never published, but part of this draft involved an inventory of the genome sequences of all the coronaviruses stored at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The virus most similar to the early strains of SARS coronavirus 2 that was stored at the lab was only 96% similar, which is to say 96% of its genome matched the early pandemic strains. That was the most similar. Now that sounds really similar, but that's a difference of over 1,000 nucleotide bases. In addition to the sequence data being inconsistent with the laboratory origin, there was no early cluster of cases at the lab. If the first case, the index case, was a lab worker who was accidentally infected, you would expect the earliest transmissions to also have occurred among lab personnel. And in fact, there was not an early cluster of cases at the lab, there wasn't a single documented case in the required time frame at the laboratory at all among any of the staff. But we could even do better than that, because in early 2020, all of the lab staff were tested for SARS coronavirus 2 antibodies, and at the time of that testing, which I believe was in February of 2020, everybody was negative. So this is all very strong evidence that the lab was not the source of SARS coronavirus 2. But the lab leak hypothesis still persists in the form of the lab leak conspiracy. Like I said, back in 2020, when we're trying to figure out what was going on, it was perfectly reasonable to think, hey, maybe the novel coronavirus that originated in the city with a lab studying coronaviruses came from the lab. Perfectly reasonable thing to think. 5 years later, we have no evidence that that happened, and the lab leak hypothesis is now the lab leak conspiracy theory. In order to understand just how out there this conspiracy theory is, we're going to go through some of the stuff that would have to have gone on and would still be happening in order for the lab leak to actually be the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so first, the lab has to be hiding viral samples and genome sequences. There would have to be other viruses on site beyond those that we know about, most likely collected before 2018, but for some reason not included in that draft manuscript. Now, the lab staff would have to know ahead of time which ones to hide and which ones to include, but how could they know which one would become the pandemic through an accidental release, right? They'd have to correctly guess which viruses would accidentally infect the lab staff and then go on to cause a global pandemic. They'd also have to hide early cases in personnel at the lab. And again, there's no documented cases of infections at the lab prior to the outbreak at the market, and in fact from some time afterwards as well. Now, the cover-up would have to extend even further than that, because we're not just talking about hiding cases. We would have to be hiding or faking antibody test results from early 2020, because again, the lab staff was all tested to see if they had COVID antibodies. You'd also have to fake the blood bank test results that I mentioned earlier to obscure cryptic circulation that was going on before the market outbreak. And then let's just zoom in on the lab itself and think about the logistics of hiding this secret activity at the lab, right? We're talking about secret research activity, possible locations in the lab that are off limits, or samples that are segregated away from, the rest of the viruses that are being stored. Some of that stuff had to be going on, and nobody said anything about it at any point, including US collaborators working not just with the people at the lab, but occasionally at the lab itself. We also have to think about the lab operations, right? Labs need supplies. Supplies have to be ordered and paid for and accounted for. So now we're talking about procurement. We're talking about storeroom records and discrepancies. Cost for supplies not accounted for by the on-the-books work that's going on. People have to do this work. If we're talking about a restricted lab space, it gets even harder, because you have to maintain a laboratory, right? You have to keep it clean. You have to maintain the plumbing, the HVAC. Labs need really good ventilation. Someone's got to be doing all that work. What about the janitorial staff? Are the bench researchers, the scientists actually working with the viruses, also taking out their own trash and mopping their own floors? I doubt it. And of course, there has to be correspondence, which means email servers, which means IT staff, unless nothing was ever written down. Ever. My point with all this is that once you start thinking through the logistics of what would have actually had to have gone on for there to have been a laboratory origin for COVID, and for that origin to stay secret, you very quickly realize that it would be a cover-up requiring hundreds, if not thousands of people inside and outside of the lab, and inside and outside of China for that matter. All of this is to say, the lab leak is a conspiracy theory. So I want to wrap this up right where I started. In 2020, this was a perfectly legitimate hypothesis to check out, and it would have been irresponsible not to do that. And that's what we did. With everything we know now, it's been ruled out to the extent we can rule anything out in science. The only way it could possibly work is this massive cover-up involving people on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. SARS coronavirus 2 wasn't a lab leak. It's a conspiracy theory to say otherwise. Period. Full stop. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to hit the buttons, like, subscribe, leave a comment, share this video whenever you run into COVID-related lab leak nonsense, because it all is nonsense. Please consider becoming a channel member for immediate access to my pre-recorded videos, and as always, don't get fooled.